want to use the Cape Wind project as an example of a typical case study that a policy analyst may get involved with. The Cape Wind project is an extremely interesting one. It was very popular, very much discussed and studied in the 2000s. It's a case study that was designed, the project was designed to be built off the coast of Massachusetts, particularly off the Nantucket area. It was a project that was supported by the federal, state, and local government. It was very high visibility. The idea was to create a template for wind developments along the east coast of the United States. It also makes a very, very interesting case study for how analysis is done, and in particular the role of science in these kinds of policy issues. Well, wind power is a typical example of a case study that a policy analyst, particularly one dealing with ecological or environmental policy analysis, would be involved with. These wind farms, just to put a little context here, are not your typical little house on a prairie wind farm. These are large industrial scale activities, and you can see in the photograph in the upper right, these windmills and supports just dwarf the average human. Another aspect, as you see in the lower left, is that the wind farms are an issue oftentimes, but equally an issue, sometimes more of an issue, is the transmission lines, because typically wind farms are located in places where the demand for power is limited and the power has to be transported to urban centers, and that requires transmission lines, and transmission lines cover a lot of land that a lot of people wish those lines didn't go. On the lower right, we see an example of a side effect that is adverse. All sources of energy have adverse side effects. And this is an example of one where a large population of migratory waterfowl is going through a wind farm, and this is not a good situation from a bird perspective. They also are blamed, wind farms are blamed for a lot of bat mortalities, and some of these bats are actually listed as either threatened or endangered under the Endangered Species Act. That's not to say that wind farms are inherently good or bad, but like all sources of energy, all activities, there are side effects that you wish didn't occur, but they do. Well, let's look at some of the examples of typical policy questions that a person may get involved with. First of all, should any be built? Perhaps the policy might be, forget it, too expensive, the power's too expensive, they cause too many adverse environmental effects, don't build any. Where should they be built? Assuming they should be built at all, where? Should we locate them in remote locations and run power transmission lines to them? Or perhaps we should locate them where the people are, but that has other side effects that may not be too desirable. And equally important, who should pay? Right now, wind farms, generally speaking, get pretty heavy subsidies from state and federal taxpayers, either in the form of direct funds or tax deductions or tax credits. Should that occur? And if it doesn't occur, then perhaps most of these wouldn't be built. And so if you want to build, you've got to be able or willing to subsidize them. Again, these are questions that are typical for any of these kinds of policy issues. Well, in a democracy, how are such questions answered? If you ask scientists, in my experience, many scientists take the view, they wouldn't use this term typically, but they follow the linear model. And the linear model of policymaking is very typical among technocrats. These are largely scientists, engineers, and so forth, which tend to see these kinds of problems as one of largely technical or scientific aspects. So the linear model is prevalent out there, particularly those who have a scientific or engineering background. Well, here's how the linear model works. The idea is that you have scientists on the left here produce information or technical specifications or whatever the issue is. It goes through this black box, or in this case a red circle, the political process where it's chewed around and so forth. People look at the data, look at the results, and they come up with a decision. And very simple. Scientists produce information, the political process evaluates the information, makes a decision, and kicks it out. This is also called sometimes the information deficit model, because if there's debate or dissension in the political process, the assumption is it's lack of scientific information. If we just had better science or better engineering, the solution to this particular problem would be clear. So lack of information, i.e. the information deficit, is really the problem typically. Sometimes this is called, quote, science-based policymaking. I have a problem with it using that term because I've never run into anybody that's against science-based policymaking, which means I don't really think it means anything because there's really no opposition to it. And so every policy decision is in part based on science and in part based on lots of other things that are not scientific information. Well, I'm here to disabuse you today that this is not the way the world typically works. The linear model, the information deficit model, is not the way the world works for policy issues, except for the most trivial one. And how do scientists respond when they first realize this is not the way the world works in reality? Well, I would characterize the response something like this. If those lousy politicians only understood the science, the correct choice would be obvious. The reason we have problems is because these clowns who are politicians just don't understand things. If we had better, brighter people, preferably scientists and engineers, running this country, we'd be a lot better off. Or scientists typically take the view that the public is scientifically illiterate, which is essentially true, and therefore experts ought to make the policy decision. And this is a technocracy model in contrast to the democracy model, and that is really let the experts decide these questions. The general public just isn't capable of making these decisions, and if they do make them, they tend to get involved in emotional issues and they don't stick to the facts. Well, how are decisions really made? Now, that's the way it's not made, the linear model, but how are they made in practice? Well, they make it when it's described how it's made, scientists usually react with, oh my God, I can't believe it. This is the way the world operates. This is terrible. I cannot believe this is the way the railroads run. It tends to be shocking when scientists are first exposed to policy issues that aren't any but the most trivial. Well, the linear model is a simplistic view of policymaking. So my advice to you today is don't fall for it. Just strike it off your list of things to worry about right off the bat. But that leaves the question is, how is decision-making done, policy-making done for real-world problems? In a democracy, how does the public answer these kinds of questions? And this is our venture into reality, the way the world operates, and we'll look at the case study as the Cape Wind Project. Let's consider the reality of how these questions are asked. Sure, we have scientists producing information. Sure, we have a political process that chooses science along with every other input to the decision-making process, and somehow out pops a decision. And the decision may be to do nothing, or the decision may be to maintain the status quo, or the decision may be to change things. Even a, quote, non-decision is in fact reality a decision. But that is the political process, politics. And politics is simply the mechanism, the procedures, the approach that society uses to answer important and complex questions. A lot of folks are turned off by the whole concept of politics, but politics is the process by which these decisions are made. Well, let's use the Cape Wind Project as a case study. Sure, when we look at the diagram across the center here, scientists producing information to the political process and out pops a decision, that part is by definition always going to be there. But we all recognize that on a project like the proposed Cape Wind project, there were in fact supporters, pretty active supporters, and there were opponents who said, forget it, no way. So an early lesson to learn is there are not only two sides. Every case study involves multiple sides. We tend to look at projects as those in favor and those against, but people are in favor of or against for many, many different reasons, and there's a lot of opposing views that vary depending on the nature of the policy option on the table. Well, let's dig a little deeper into the Cape Wind project and look at some of the other players. For sure, we have climate advocates. Climate advocates in general would be very much in favor of projects like this. Let's get with it. Let's get these things built. In fact, let's get a lot more built. Let's get off the fossil fuel energy sources. Let's get going on these new kinds of sources. Let's move along. But then again, we also have the not in my backyard, the NIMBY advocates who say, well, it may be a great idea, but preferably let's do these out in Iowa someplace or Wyoming, someplace where there's not a lot of people, or you can pay people because it's their land. They'll stick a windmill in the middle of their cornfield and be happy to get the royalties. NIMBY arguments are typically of the type, I may or may not like the idea, but I don't like it here. And so this was a project, Cape Wind was a project that ran into a lot of opposition because a lot of these were very high-end houses, very affluent. The late Senator Ted Kennedy and lots of other folks of similar type had places there, and their view, mostly off the record, but they were influential, is not here. I haven't lived here for hundreds of years, a family compound. Don't get on my back deck and look at a wind farm of all things. So the NIMBY arguments take many forms, and oftentimes the NIMBY arguments are not couched as they don't want it here. They're couched with other kinds of wrapping to make them appear not to be a NIMBY argument, and I'll elaborate on this in a minute. Another group, a whole class of advocates involved in the process would be the various organizations such as Audubon, such as the various conservation groups, the various, community development groups and so forth. These would be advocates who would say, as an Audubon being an example, not a great location, Eastern Flyway, we're in the birds. This is a major flyway, going to be a lot of mortality here, do it elsewhere. Whereas other kinds of groups may be very enthusiastically in favor of it. Look, it's going to generate a lot of jobs, a lot of tax revenue, let's do it. So there's advocates across the political spectrum that are playing here. Then we have organizations like the American Wind Energy Association. This is a professional or company association of groups, companies that manufacture or support wind operations. And these are not small players. These are the General Electrics of the world, the Siemens of the world. These are large companies whose job in life is to help their members sell or service the products, i.e. wind farms. And so they're going to be very active in terms of pushing this. We ought to be doing this one, plus lots of others. Let's get cracking on it. Then we have other competing groups like the solar advocates. I mean, these operations a lot of times get either tax dollars directly or indirectly through tax credits. The solar advocates are probably never going to be against wind power, but their argument's going to be essentially, hey, the future's in solar power. This is old technology, causes lots of problems with birds and bats. Our stuff is much better, much more reliable, etc., etc. Let's really spend our tax dollars on solar power, not wind power or the other alternatives. Then we have another group that vary depending on the case study, but like the fishing advocates. This area is an area that's supported a commercial fishing activity for hundreds of years. And there's a lot of folks who would be displaced by this activity. A lot of the fishermen use this area to troll for various types of fish. And they would argue, look, we've been here for hundreds of years. There's no way we can run our nets and gear through this maze of wind farms and underwater cables. This is going to put us out of business and so forth. We oppose this project. Do it if you want, just do it elsewhere. Then we have organizations, media, for example, that take a different role and will tend to slant their news coverage in a way that either supports or doesn't support. And for example, a lot of folks early on were surprised when National Broadcasting Company, NBC, tended to do puff pieces, that is kind of cheerleader pieces for things like wind power. And if you look a little bit deeper in it, at the time, not now, but at the time, NBC was owned by General Electric. Surprise, surprise. General Electric is at that time the first or second largest manufacturer of wind turbines. Not surprising their news company would tend to be in favor of wind power. Before you think that other sources don't have similar bias, one of the major underwriters of NPR, which tends to be very much of a pro renewable power, particularly pro-wind. One of the major underwriters is, surprise, surprise, General Electric. So always be cautious of media in terms of their vested interest in issues. With this project, For this project, we have an interesting problem or a challenge to analysis because these projects oftentimes or almost always would not be viable unless they were subsidized by the taxpayers. In a lot of respects, they're similar when the transcontinental railroads were built after the Civil War. These were really railroads to nowhere because there was nothing in the West in terms of economics. And so these railroads were built basically on spec, and no one is going to spend their own money to do this. And so the taxpayers ended up subsidizing the railroads. They gave the railroad investors land in exchange for building this railroad, but it was a tax subsidy. And these days, of course, wind farms get a tax subsidy or a tax credit. And so as a result, you have companies like automobile companies like Tesla, who makes more money on their tax credits, which they get from other companies who aren't manufacturing electric cars. And so you get a situation where it's worthwhile for a Tesla to make electric cars because those tax credits are so lucrative. There's nothing right or wrong about this. It's just the way it is. Some people would argue that you never would have built the transcontinental railroads in any time close to the 1870s unless you had tax subsidies. And other people say that these wind farms would never get started unless you subsidize it by the taxpayers. Again, this is the policy difference. There's not a right or wrong answer here. It's just an issue to be factored in. Then we have other advocates who take on different permutations, and these might be called the health advocates. Again, I mentioned earlier that NIMBY, not my backyard advocates, rarely wrap their advocacy in actual NIMBYism. They usually wrap it in health. For example, a lot of folks will say that these wind farms, when they're up and operational, are not healthy. They tend to cause this flickering 24/7, which tends to bring on epilepsy. I mean, I have no idea if this is true. I doubt it's true, but you don't really know. And there's been a lot of studies. And of course, these are difficult things to answer categorically. A lot of people don't like the noise of these things. Again, they run 24/7. And as one person described living relatively near a windmill, the best example is go down to your dryer, your clothes dryer, throw a tennis shoe in and get a chair and sit in front of it and listen to these tennis shoes go round and around and around for 24 hours and see if you can stand it. Now, I have no idea if this is true. But anyway, there's a lot of people who claim health issues associated with these wind farms. Again, it's a factor that is involved in the political process. And of course, with all these projects, we have proposers. We have people who are pushing them. A lot of times these are state and local government because they're obviously looking for the tax revenue to diversify their economies and so forth. So they have a vested interest in let's get it built. It's going to bring a lot of jobs to our community, our area. It's going to get a tax revenue in the future in terms of transporting power. It's basically a good thing. So the political process tends to be in favor of these projects because there's people who will benefit. Not right or wrong, just is. And then you get things that come out of who knows where. This particular project, the people that were living there, what you might call the high-end people who had housing compounds along Nantucket, tended to argue that the radar effects of these wind farms would be inappropriately bad for national security. In other words, this is an Air Force area, and with these wind farms, they would alter the radar and cause major problems for the military. Now, I have no idea if that's really their concerns or they just didn't want the project there, and the best way to do that is say this is a national security issue. And of course, these had to be studied, and it took about 3 years for the studies to be done. And finally, the Department of Defense came out and said, no, we're not really too concerned about it. Don't worry about it on our standpoint. But nonetheless, it set the project back several years. And then you have other ones that are equally surprising. Historic place. This area back in the 1600s was much, much cooler than it is now. This was a little ice age, so the sea levels were much, much lower than they are now, and a lot of these areas that the wind farms would be built in were actually dry land 300 or 400 years ago. And these were places, allegedly, that two of the local Indian tribes use as historic burial areas and so forth, and they challenged and said, these are historic sites, indigenous sites, you need to preserve them and so forth. And eventually, that debate ended up with a cash settlement for the tribes for their pain and suffering on these issues. And so those are the kinds of issues that come up, and in part they're based on science, but based on lots of other factors that you can speculate about, but nonetheless they cause debate on the project. Another aspect that is far out, especially for scientists and others to really accept, is the fact that when this project was started, it would involve heavy subsidies from the federal taxpayers. And of course, when you ask for federal taxpayers to pay for something in a place like Massachusetts, everybody else might say, forget it. Why would we do this to help you out? But in fact, the upper Midwest, a number of years ago, got a major tax subsidy for the ethanol mandate, which was basically a mandate to force companies to put ethanol in their gasoline, and ethanol comes largely from corn. And so the price of corn, the demand for corn went way up when the mandate went in place. And when this issue came up with the Cape Wind project on the tax subsidies, the Massachusetts delegation was very readily made apparent to the upper Midwest states, look, we backed you when you wanted your ethanol subsidy. Now we want your backing when we want our subsidy for the Cape Wind project. And of course, the Subsidy Act, in fact, did pass. Again, this is, it's kind of the way politics works. It's not good or bad, it just is. And you're going to be very disappointed in it if you think it works any other way. And finally, the last factor, and there's many others, but I'll stop with the last factor, and that is scientists are available to help out any of these advocates. Scientists who work for the universities, either through they'll wear their consultant hat, or they'll get a university contract, private consultants, or anybody else. So there's plenty of scientists that'll be more than happy to work on this project from any of these vantage points. Now, what are the lessons to learn? And let me wrap up with 3 of these lessons that I think any scientist ought to go home with and apply to future case studies. So imagine if you're a scientist, you're looking at this issue, trying to figure out what's going on. What are the lessons learned? First, science is used by nearly every actor in the political debate. Every one of these advocacy groups, these organizations, will wrap their pitches, their policy pitches, in science. So science is not provided only by one source. There are many, many sources that'll provide all the science you want about a case study. So that's the first lesson learned. The second lesson learned is that science is an effective advocacy weapon in public policy pitches. It's kind of like negative campaign ads. No one really likes them, but they continue to be used because they work. And this is why science tends to get used and abused in policy pitches, because it works. And I don't see it changing anytime soon. So virtually every advocate involved in this case study will use science to try to sell and help sell his pitch. Third lesson learned. As a user of science, imagine if you were the policymaker who had to decide on this project. You had to make a decision whether this project ought to go forward, it ought to get a permit or not. So you were a user of science, along with every other source of information coming into this case study. Who would you trust to present policy-neutral information? Recognizing that every advocacy group will wrap their pitches in science, so who provides science that you think would be confident is in fact policy neutral? Not an easy question. This is a question that policymakers have to ask all the time. What really are the facts of the case, and what are the issues that sound like facts, but they're really twisted to help sell a policy preference? If you're a scientist or likely to become a scientist, or you're likely to get involved in policy issues, I wish you luck. It's an exciting field, an exciting opportunity, and it's one that you really ought to go into it with your eyes wide open, and you won't be surprised by the various twists and turns that these case studies take. Thank you.